Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this really interesting panel on infrastructuring the digital world. My name is Rikke. I'm from the Danish Human Rights Institute in Copenhagen, and I'm really happy to be here in this beautiful venue and with this very, very interesting topic. I've been working on the human rights implications of technology companies generally and big tech specifically for a number of years. Not so much in a geopolitical perspective, but nevertheless, I think it's really, really crucial to move the debate in this direction. So, and I think the papers on this panel are all extremely interesting, so I'm very much looking forward. As you know, we are running a little bit over time, but we will try to manage. So there also will be a bit of time for Q&As after the 5 presentations rather. So with those few remarks, allow me to introduce the first speaker, which will be Hawkins, sitting next to me from the Australian National University. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you. Yes, my name is Zoe. I'm coming from the Australian National University's Tech Policy Design Centre. So we're a think tank based inside a university. And the perspective that I'm bringing today is that of a tech policy practitioner. So I'm not an academic by career. I've actually been working working in tech policy originally as a think tanker, but then in the Australian government, in the Foreign Affairs Department on cyber affairs, looking at that foreign policy relationship between governments on tech issues, and then worked as a ministerial advisor looking at domestic tech policy in the communication and innovation portfolios before swapping sides of the table and going to big tech and working in Amazon's public policy team before returning to a think tank, which is where I am now. So let's just give you a sense of the perspective that I'm bringing today. And last year, I made a brief return into academia to conduct some research at Oxford, which is what I'm presenting to you today. Which is big tech on the world stage, corporate or foreign affairs. And I guess the reason I situated where I'm coming from on this is because my research interest was really born out of my observations sort of working in this space, that there seem to be a lot of conflicting narratives around what this relationship is between big tech and governments. You know, there's a few headlines up on the slide, but essentially, sometimes it's that governments are cracking down, they're reining in big tech, they're subjugating them to their national sovereignty. And sometimes we're looking at them for help and assistance in conflict to support democracy. And we're even seeing governments create tech ambassadors to the tech sector. And so I find that really interesting that there were these sort of contradictory narratives about what's happening here. And so to me, that was the puzzle that I wanted to spend a bit of time unpacking. And I guess, why does that matter? I was interested from it, I guess, from practitioners' perspective. I think it helps to understand what is going on so that people on both sides of government and big tech know how to engage in this space and what does contemporary international relations look like. So today, and I'm going to be very quick because I know that we're short of time, I'll talk a little bit about how I tried to distill what those opposing narratives are, the approach that I took in trying to create some new research to add to the conversation, and what I sort of produced in terms of a way of thinking about why these contradictions exist. So I'll start with, there's 2 narratives I'm going to talk through. The first one, techno-nationalism. This will be very familiar to this room. It's already been spoken about a bit today. This idea that states are still the powerful and dominant force in international relations, and that big tech companies really just represent the latest way that these governments extend their power across the world. So I've got down some examples there of literature discussions that would sort of capture this idea of state capitalism, client net states, and that sort of list there. I won't go through each one. But I suppose, it positions these big tech companies as tools of realist state power, and looks at the examples of how you see that play out is when we view tech companies as examples of foreign government interference. And so those discussions would include the concerns around the Snowden revelations in terms of the relationship between US big tech and US intelligence, and similarly, the BRI is the Belt and Road Initiative, but also examples of the very strong narrative around the relationship between Chinese tech and the Chinese government, particularly seen in democratic governments taking moves to ban Huawei in their 5G infrastructure. And this sort of view that the big tech companies represent the interests of their home states. as opposed to the second narrative that I'm interested in, which is this idea of tech exceptionalism, which is really more of a liberal narrative, and it's an extension of some of the discussions that started as early as the 80s and 90s around the growing power of transnational corporations just generally in an age of globalization. So they've kind of extended this logic further to say, these companies actually have, these non-state actors have international relations relevance in their own right, as opposed to just as an extension of the government that they, of the country that they come from. And that perhaps they're starting to wield a novel international relations power, that they actually are more independent from their home governments and that they themselves represent a geopolitical actor in and of themselves. And examples of where we see that play out is this idea that governments are standing up tech diplomats, sort of diplomatic services that engage directly with these companies in the way that they do with other governments. And this idea of the role of tech companies in global governance forums, diplomacy and conflict, sort of the elevated status of companies in international relations. Okay, and so my question was, and we're going to hear a lot of really interesting research today, and there is a lot of really interesting research about more empirical evidence around what is happening and how you define power, and whether it's economic power, infrastructure power, these sorts of things, roles in conflict, lots of case studies about how do we unpack what is actually happening. What I was interested in is this idea of perception and positioning of power, and how does the role of narratives and the way we understand the identity of these companies play out in creating a new reality. So I spoke to expert practitioners who sit on either side of this relationship between US big tech companies, so people in the companies, and people inside Five Eyes governments that relate with those tech company representatives, and spoke to both sides through 20 expert interviews to try and get to this question of how do they perceive this contradictory narrative that's going on? Is it that these companies are representations of their home governments, or are these companies something new, something different for international relations? So a little bit of a sense of who was in the informant group. So unfortunately I had to aggregate the backgrounds just because a lot of it was anonymized, but to give you a sense of the diversity of perspectives that are in the group that I drew the research from. So people who worked in the big tech companies covered regions from Europe, North America, Africa, Asia Pacific. People that I spoke to had worked at that list of big tech companies, so quite a different range of perspectives across the companies. Government representatives from the Five Eyes, but also across portfolios, so everything from defense to industry, and different roles too. So from a perspective of governments, from diplomats to political advisors, there's different arms of government. And what did that show? The main thing that I would just highlight first is this idea that it's really context and interest-based. What the informants were telling me was the way that this relationship is positioned is informed by particular context of how each actor views their interests in that one interaction. It's this idea, and I've got some quotes here that I've bolded out for you, but it's a pendulum, that people are trying to have it both ways. They want to have their cake and eat it too. Sometimes the companies will say, we're really big and powerful, and then sometimes they'll say, oh, we're just a company. And that sort of duality of positioning by the same governments and the same companies was like an overarching observation from the interviews. And so it led me to try and understand, well, what are the incentives of these dimensions of how, if I was a big tech company, in what context and why would I present myself as aligned to my home country? So in this case, the US government, that's the image on the left. And why would I sometimes want to position myself as more independent from my home government? And really, the interviews really drew out the reasons that sit behind that sort of the why you would do both. So I guess the alignment story that came through was this idea of being a trusted Five Eyes partner. So this idea that you sort of have an automatic alliance by association. If you're Amazon, for example, and you're trying to pitch into a Five Eyes government, the fact that you are aligned to a US government interest is useful for business. And one of the quotes was, national security is a really big driver. There's a common enemy. There's this idea that's the driving factor. You also benefit from US economic diplomacy. So in these Five Eyes government contexts, and sorry, I'm sure most people here are familiar, but that would be the intelligence alliance between America, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. You also benefit from the economic pressure that the US government would put on these foreign governments for the interests of that US business interest. But sometimes it's not helpful to be aligned. And that view of positioning yourself as more independent from the US government, if you are a US tech company, is to avoid anti-US sentiment that can change over time. So so post-Snowden was a real big theme that came up in the interviews, that people from big tech said, when that happened, we wanted to put it at arm's length. We wanted foreign governments to think we're not in the pockets of the US government, actually. We're our own thing. There's also a growing political appeal in these sort of Five Eyes markets in Australia as an example, of it being very politically popular for the local government, the Australian government, to demand market localization. And so US tech companies trying to seem very French in their streaming services or very Australian in the content that they make available is something that's playing politically. And that's another reason why they might swing towards independence rather than alignment. And the second dimension that came through is, okay, from the government's perspective, how do they position how these big tech companies play in international relations? Sometimes they're elevating them into this diplomatic status, this higher place in international relations, sort of leaning on them in these like sort of a global ideological debate. And that was actually one of the reasons that came through, which is, why would they do that? Well, one of my informants said, we need multi-stakeholders to balance out authoritarian states. So there are some contexts where these governments think that actually lending and portraying more power and diplomatic status on these companies actually is useful for their broader international security dynamics. And also another thing that came through, this idea of, is it a way of generating more corporate accountability? Is describing these companies as, well, you are a big global player, you have outsized influence on the world, you are different to other companies, so you have to take more responsibility. That was a narrative that came through as well. A quote was, by giving them a greater say, would they take on more responsibility? So that's another motivation for the elevation. But governments also have reasons in circumstances to, is the word I've used, is demote these, the status of these companies. But essentially that's reassert their state sovereignty. One of the themes that was coming through was this idea that government officials felt the need to defend the distinction in mandate between these companies and their governments that they represented, in terms of that they're unelected companies as opposed to the elected governments that these officials worked for, and that they felt it was very important to reassert their sovereignty, to regulate in their jurisdictions, and that these companies are not special and have to comply like everybody else does. And the second reason that they might do that is also what I've mentioned already before, around this localization politics, which I think is a part of a broader trend away from globalization, this idea that jurisdictions are wanting to really enforce their fingerprint on their jurisdiction in an age of transnational tech companies. And so the question of, if those are the different dimensions, so you've got companies deciding whether they are aligned or independent, and you've got governments deciding whether they're elevating or demoting these companies, what influences how they make that choice? Well, two of the themes that came through was this idea of portfolio. So if you're talking to somebody in an intelligence agency or in defense, their idea about how to deal with this issue is going to be very different to if you're speaking to the industry portfolio, because they just have different priorities, and that's how governments are set up, is to contest and compete different policy interests. And so this is actually also, this structure is also reflected inside these big tech companies. So you have different people in that company that will have a different policy priority as part of their portfolio. They will view this situation differently. So who is speaking to who on the government and the tech side depends will influence how that conversation goes in any context. And similarly, the contextual politics of the moment, as I said, if there'd been a change in president, or if there was another revelation about some sort of relationship between tech and governments, that would shape the interests of how both sides position what's going on. And so to try and bring this together, and there's a bit of a visual on the screen, I just felt that there were these two dimensions playing out. And really the purpose of the visual on the screen is to explain how both of these narratives of tech exceptionalism and techno-nationalism come to coexist essentially in this ecosystem. So you can see up on the screen, when a government, which is the vertical axis, is elevating the status of a company and saying this, Microsoft is a really important part of our diplomacy, at the same time as that company is saying, yeah, we don't represent the interests of the US government, that's when you would basically create a scenario where you see tech exceptionalism. At the same time, when a government is reasserting their state sovereignty, subjugating the power of these companies, at the same time as they might be presenting themselves as really aligned with their home government, that's when you see that story of techno-nationalism, and I've got the politics and portfolio influences there, just to say that where those two actors, where there's two sides of the scenario position themselves on those two axes is influenced by those things. And so that is a bit of a way to I guess, map and explain why we're seeing these different stories all appear at the same time. And I guess the reason I found that interesting is that, as I said, it explains that duality in the literature and the conversation and the storytelling. It allows us to map how that comes to be. And I guess where to from here, I really want to try and apply that potential explanatory model to a range of case studies. I think that'd be very interesting, particularly since having done this research at the end of last year, a lot of the conversations have moved forward, particularly around the relationship between governments and AI companies leading the generative AI boom. I'm sure that there'd be some really interesting case studies there, but also questions of how does that interaction change? So for example, the way that I've oversimplified that to create that diagram, it assumes like a one-time interaction, but obviously the relationships between these governments and tech companies is multi-round. So how do you work out how that cumulative learning affects that relationship, and also potentially applying it in very specific geostrategic frames? So I'm from Australia. The Indo-Pacific has a very interesting dynamic on these tech geopolitical issues. I think it'd be interesting to see whether the way that mapping logic works in, say, the Indo-Pacific region maybe is different as it is in Europe. And I'm sure there are cultural differences that play into that. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I went through that as quickly as I could, but I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody else and having a bit of Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Super interesting research. And while we shift places up here, I can provide you with a bit of background that Denmark was actually one of the first countries to appoint such a tech diplomat as part of our foreign ministry, a person that was first based in the US and that has now moved to Brussels. So we've discussed a lot precisely what role and legitimacy such a function provides vis-a-vis state-big tech relations. And now we will we'll move on to our next speakers. And I'm not sure if I can pronounce this correct, but it's Olivier. Olivier Chatain.
It's perfect.
It's perfect.
It's absolutely perfect.
And you have a co-writer that's not here, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And you are from HEC? HEC?
Yeah.
HEC Paris.
Paris.
Yes.
No, just kidding.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really want to thank the organizers for being courageous to try to put in the same room all these people who have very different perspectives of so to say the same elephants. And some of you will see, oh, this is a leg, this is a trunk. Oh no, this is a feather, and that's part of what we're trying to go beyond. So this paper is at a very early stage, and we're in the middle of moving forward on it. It's by myself. This is co-authored with my almost graduating PhD student, Madhulika Kaul, who will start in the fall a job at Bayes Business School at City University in London. And this paper is coming from, let's say, this is the background of the paper, kind of the origin story, is that a few years ago, I read an early version of the paper by Farrell and Newman about weaponized interdependence. And I was shocked. I was, oh, this is the world we live in, and that's extremely interesting. And everything is happening on the properties of private firms. And I'm a business school professor, so I should know about it. And I look around with my colleagues, no one speaks about it, no one knows about it. So what I wanted to do is to bring a business strategy perspective on this, where one of the premises is that firms are agentic, they follow the logic of their business models, and that something that you can see from the investment decisions, for instance, vertical integration and scale. That's really a broad frame, and how to go to come to subsea cables. There are two branches there. One, there are a few studies on subsea cables proper, going back from Winkler about what was happening in World War I. Camille Morel, I don't know if you remember his first name, Jesvik, who's also coming from weapons interdependence. And in the past few years, I've been in touch with people working on geopolitics, and I've been aware of their work in information networks, such as Frédéric Douzet and others, really think that we can look at these abstract networks as being the imprinting of things that are happening elsewhere, but also as being the cause of things that are happening elsewhere in the physical world. So that was the start. So here's one of the maps that maybe you may be familiar with. That's from my database. There are 448 cable systems, all these lines. Some of them are dotted because they are new cable systems. About 2,000 landing stations, which is where the cables connect to the land. And this is where the politics start to come in. I'd like to draw your attention to this area, which is very, very dense. You see a lot of lines, very, very dense. That's the part of it is the South China Sea. And as we will see, and as actually as came up from the data, this is something where some action is happening. One thing that's very striking in the past few years, first, excellent articles in the Financial Times in the past few months about that, is that the overwhelming majority of the new projects and the new capacity that's installed is being installed by so-called big tech. Here, I want to take the opportunity to kind of try to break down what big tech is, because big tech is could be many, many things. And I think it's an opportunity to see that we have, even within big tech, the logics can be quite different. And if you look at subsea cables, sometimes like all the content providers, the hyperscalers, but actually it's Google and Facebook. You may think that these are the biggest riders of the surveillance capitalism, apocalypse, but that's part of, so I try to think about what does it mean for these firms to be at the forefront of installing new capacity, creating new networks that will interact with state rivalries. So I have 3 points I want to make in this presentation. First is think a little bit about why do big tech firms want to own subsea cables. Something that you may learn in the business school if you want to come, I have great classes, is that owning is a bad idea. Usually you try to avoid it. So if you own something, you must have a good reason for that. The second thing is because all these firms are US based, what's their relationship with US foreign policy, and that looks a lot like the presentation of my colleagues just before. Do these firms have any margin of autonomy in that respect? And third, it's much more speculative, but when these firms and these states interact, what does it mean for the future structure of that global network? Because that global network and its structure will in turn influence other actors. So I'm going to try to, it's very preliminary, but there's going to be a lot of question marks because I'm not 100% sure, but please, let's go. So why own subsea cable? So here is, let's say, a bunch of companies, of big tech companies. So I have added, first we have Netflix, TikTok, Apple. These firms, for instance, they don't own any cable system, at least as of now. Amazon owns one, has a few long-term contracts, Microsoft 3, but most of the action is happening with Meta and Google. And what can we try to understand about their motives by looking at these differences in policies? Because they all have the means to do things. So I would say that those on the left-hand side, they are here for you to consume videos that use a lot of bandwidth. But for that, you don't really need to own because bandwidth is bandwidth is bandwidth. So it's better to rent. You can just go to the telecommunication companies, the telcos, and you can rely on them. Now we have Amazon and Microsoft, which are a bit trickier because they do sell a lot of data center capacity. And for me, it was a puzzle for that they are not really doing much more with that. They do sell data services to third-party businesses. So my hypothesis here is that from the viewpoint of the customers, they don't want, in any case, they don't want to be renting capacity from a data center that is across an ocean because latency will be a problem. Because the main limit of communication is the speed of light, and you don't want to be across the ocean. You want to be next to it. So maybe they don't need to have elaborate networks, but they just need to collocate the data center. So that's mostly a hypothesis. And then we have the Meta and Google. So they're also hyperscalers in the sense that they are using their own data centers. Google is trying to sell some of that to the industry, but Meta is keeping it for themselves. And the common point here is that they're using the network to deliver their services. Every time you do a search on Google, there is an auction being run computationally to know which ad will go next. And so think of, I mean, each time you click and do a new search, you have all that capacity that needs to be used. And some of that information may not be located where you are. That's the same thing with Facebook, when you have, like, say, a flow, a feed, it's customized. So all these firms have to give customized content using personal data to basically half or more of the human population. So that's why maybe they need to have this integrated system, and they need to own it, because they cannot trust the telco to do things the way they want. So that would be one angle, is that some firms, among those big techs, some firms have a business model that pushes them to really control everything, while the others are happy to delegate that to others. So that was question one. Question two, using the database of cables over 12 years, I tried to have maybe a naive approach as to whether these firms were just following US policies. You know, they're just, so we should be maybe only connecting to countries that are friends to the US. So I looked at some databases, for instance, on peace dyadic relationships of the sanctioned data sets. And what I found was a bit surprising to me, and I try to rationalize it, is that actually Facebook and Google, the two ones we have, they're more, in the data, if you don't really look carefully, they are more prone to make cables, or to build cables, or to own cables that land into countries that tend to be hostile to the US. So it's a bit of a surprise to me. When you look in detail, actually is driven by China and Hong Kong. And then there's another puzzle, which is that both Facebook and Google have been banned from operating in China. So why are they connecting to China or Hong Kong? Well, so that's still an open puzzle to me. My current hypothesis is that it was sort of an accidental exposure, because we wanted to have a cable going across North Pacific. You arrive in Japan, then you want to connect to Asia. It's natural to stop in Hong Kong. However, there are some issues that came up to them. For instance, in 2020, the Team Telecom, which is the nickname of a committee that operates at the White House, that was under Trump, basically told Facebook, that was one of our projects, don't connect to Hong Kong. Just don't, okay? So, and that's why, let me just highlight a few. There are many concerns. Some of the concerns that's underlined here, and we give you the gist of it, is that, look, your cables are so good that the traffic will go through it. And if it goes through it, it will be seen from Hong Kong. We no longer trust Hong Kong as being an independent actor following the crackdown. And we suspect that the People's Republic of China will be spying. And maybe we're a bit paranoid about spying, but of course, there's some history here. So that's earlier in 2013. The Snowden revelation showed that the NSA was very happy to spy on Google, even though Google thought that they had a deal with the NSA. And for some time, the Google internal network was not encrypted, but it could be looked into from the NSA. So you could think that those firms are not 100% trusting their own government, which speaks to some of the issues we saw earlier. Now, let's think a little bit about the systemic impact.
You have time.
Okay, time. So that's something I'm working with, but the idea is to try to figure the impact of these new cables, the new systems, on the whole structure of the network. And you can compare two different situations. You could compare, how easy it is to move within that network from one part of the earth to the other when the network is complete, or you can maybe remove the cable sets that are laid by these particular firms. And then we can see what is the contribution of this network to either the speed or to the connectivity. And we want, for instance, to compare the average length of travel. We can maybe weight that by bandwidth between places with and without the cables from big tech. So my hypothesis is that pre-2018, so 2018 is when the relationships between US and China start to become more sour according to the database, but that's the Hong Kong crackdowns, basically. Pre-2018, they care about speed, it's great. Now, maybe they care about redundancy. When I say these are the big tech, they care about having alternatives because they're afraid that there are some parts of the world that they can no longer connect to, so it's not as fun. And then maybe they want to have redundancy because they've been burned a few times already by various governments, including their own. So let me give you some example, that's very speculative. So the map is from Google. And as you can see, we have an interesting understanding of the width of the Pacific Ocean, which is like 10,000 kilometers wider than it should be if you look at Alaska and Kamchatka are very far away. But these are all the cables that Google owns as of 2019. And some of the new ones are interesting, especially the QUIC one that goes south to Chile. And if I add the new ones that they are starting to create, you have two that are directly linking Australia to the West Coast. And they have another one that they are going to participate to that's linking Chile to Australia via French Polynesia and Fiji. When you can think of what's happening is that instead of moving west directly from the West Coast of the US toward Japan and Hong Kong to link to the rest of Asia, maybe now we're trying to have like alternative routes that are sadly making a detour to Australia. But Australia is a good place to go to. You're losing a few, speed of light being limited, you're losing time, but maybe it's a good backup for you to have. And the final point on this is that the existence of these projects is also creating new opportunities for all the states located in the Pacific, because now they have more bargaining power. So one hypothesis is that you start with firms that just follow their own strategy. So in that case, they need to have these cables because they need to have an integrated network of data centers for their own operation that rely notably on advertising. However, at one point, states wake up and tell you, look, we don't like what you do there. So they adapt, or they find themselves being caught in the middle, which means that they are going to find backup solutions. But these backup solutions are creating opportunities for other states. That would be one way potentially to think about this. So the arc of the story here is that big tech starts as a bystanders. They think of it, Mark Zuckerberg never thought that the goal of his life was to stand being grilled in the US Senate. Okay, that's not what he wanted to do. So all that stuff that we have to deal with, I don't think they ever wanted to touch it. Nevertheless, it's fell on them. They have to deal with it, and they try to avoid it, possibly. But by avoiding that, they're creating opportunities for others. So that would be one way potentially to think about the arc of that story. That's all I have to say for today. And there are a lot of questions, Mark, because it's very early. I just want to put a plug, though, because for another paper of mine, which is available from IRSEM, which tackles the same kind of issue between, okay, let's think about the business model of firms, of big tech firms. Let's do that from a business school professor viewpoint and see how it connects to the issues that a lot of you are concerned with. For instance, in that case, it was content moderation. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping exactly on time. Shall we? It's okay. You can also stay where you are and just you're not open. Ah, okay. Merci. Okay, and while Francesca is setting up her slides, I can just say that I can recommend a new book from two of my Danish colleagues from Copenhagen University that's called Gateways, Open Access, that actually maps the digital infrastructure system in the Nordic countries. Okay, and so the next speakers will be Francesca Musiani and Clément Perarnaud from CNRS here in Paris.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you. So Clément is from Vrije Universiteit Brussel, but he's actually also very much involved in the CNRS working group on internet governance that this work actually sort of originates from, at least in spirit. So hello everyone. So I'm going to switch from the co-organizer hat to a presenter hat for like 7 minutes 30 before leaving the floor to Clément to talk briefly about some work we've been doing in the last year with a small funding from the DNS Research Federation on a standardization process surrounding QUIC. So this is the outline of a paper that we have in the making. There is a complete draft after a phase of field work that I will be introducing later. So we're going to do four things. I will do more like the first part, introducing you to the actual object and some of the methods and our theoretical inspirations to tackle it. And Clément will eventually turn to the questions that are more closely involving this particular conference on geopolitical aspects and state versus big tech relations, notably. So we investigate the development and deployment process of QUIC, which is a new, and some of our interviewees have even argued that it's like revolutionary. In any case, it appears to be a deeply transformative, potentially deeply transformative process of standardization that has been spearheaded by the Internet Engineering Task Force. So this is one of the leading internet standardization, global internet standardization organizations that has been, there are a few dedicated papers to how it works, and it has some peculiarities with respect to other leading standardization organizations, such as the World Wide Web Consortium, for example, that is heavily industry-led. In the ITF, people participate more in their personal capacity, although they do have an employer on the side. So especially this particular relation has been investigated at times. This is an ITF-led effort. What really has been very interesting to us to observe about this particular standard is that Google has a heavy role in the different steps of its development. It was initially designed by Google, and it is proposed as an alternative to the main and historical transport protocol on the internet, TCP, and it seeks to provide a new technical architecture to communicate and encrypt data through the global internet. So we have looked at QUIC as something that infrastructures things on the internet, so to speak. So infrastructure is a noun, but in recent years there has been a body of more recent works that have used it as a verb. So like to infrastructure something is about structuring and shaping a number of processes that happen by and on the internet. So we wanted to see what has QUIC done to a number of things, and we have notably focused on some socio-technical controversies that have happened around the development of this protocol, mostly related to some technical bits, and I will very briefly talk about them later, because it is very difficult to get to mention them without getting into details. But overall, those controversies interested us, as it often happens with social technical controversies, because they are tools to look at broader things. So in particular, how big issues in internet governance and policy today, such as encryption, state sovereignty, and surveillance, happen around the discussions and the development of this particular technical bits. So we wanted in this context to explore Google's affordances in reshaping the technical architecture of the internet by fostering this particular protocol. And our main research question has been what has been both enabled and constrained by the QUIC standardization process, and what are the implications of this for the future of the internet. So just a quick word on our methods. So we have combined political science with STS, which are where we come from, respectively, Clément and I, with the idea that merging these two perspectives is a way to mirror that standard setting is intrinsically an interdisciplinary thing. It draws from the technical aspects, of course, but a lot of things are happening in and around it. We have drawn on some past work that I've done in the past with Laura Denardis in particular, with around the ways in which infrastructures are promoted or co-opted for motives that move beyond the technical functionalities that they are initially aimed to fulfill. We draw on this concept of infrastructuring that has been developed by STS scholars in the last decade mostly, and so we apply it as we tried to do a little bit in recent years to the study of internet governance and digital sovereignty. So I've written a paper that is a research agenda type about this idea of infrastructuring digital sovereignty, and we draw on the qualitative analysis of the IETF mailing list that is related to QUIC, and we have complemented it with a number of semi-structured interviews. Clément has done a number of them in Prague at an IETF meeting, and we have conducted several others online together. There is this idea that the quick standardization processes happen from the shoulders of a giant, namely Google. So just to give a quick genealogy of QUIC, Google has been very much in the driving seat because it has designed the earliest version of this protocol in-house, and it was known as GQuic, for its own services and servers. It has been enabled by default on the browser used by Google Chrome, and used by other services of Google, such as YouTube. And this has happened for several years before the standard actually found its way to the IETF. And Google identified a number of strong incentives to proceed to its generalization at the global level. And the interviews we conducted underline that indeed the degree of sophistication of the QUIC proposal to the IETF has only been possible thanks to a number of resources that have been mobilized. And in particular, this proposal was the result of a massive investment of Google into hiring a number of leading engineers in their respective fields in the early 2000s. And it mirrored, according to the experts we interviewed, sort of a brain drain strategy that had been used before by other big tech actors, notably by Cisco. So the early design phase of QUIC benefited from the ability of Google to really test thoroughly its protocol through its infrastructure for years, both from the client and server sides. So a sizable portion of our paper describes how so this process has had a fair amount of raising and resolving controversies within the IETF around the specific points. So just to very briefly go through them, and we explain them in more detail in the paper. They were about the fallback option, so how technical actors could fall back to something in case of a quick connection fails, the extent to which the nature of the scope and whether it should be made mandatory or not to foster a cryptographic model, and finally the so-called spin bit, so the idea of should there be a specification and should it be again mandatory or not. And the outcome of the process could indeed be described as a silent revolution with Google at its core, because there is a general recognition that the outcome, the issue of the standardization process is not exactly what Google initially came with. It did signal an evolution of the technical proposal encompassing more concerns. Yet we were able to single out several ways in which the development of QUIC is indeed a process by which Google has mobilized, sometimes very discreetly by means of nudges and other techniques, but very effectively, as it usually does, other large players in realizing that such a shift in the transport layer of the internet would really benefit the entire industry. And so there is this Cisco report, I believe, that has recently, like in early 2024, that has shown the extent to which there has been a substantial evolution of QUIC traffic in the early 2020s, very much in the favor of wider and wider adoption of QUIC. And I will give the floor to Clément for the second part.
Thank you, Francesca.
Tu peux venir parce que il te voit en fait.
Thank you, Francesca. So as you've seen, QUIC has now become a reality for the internet, and it appears to have operated a great shift for the internet industry. And so in this part, we will explore what this means for the network as a whole, and first how to understand QUIC in the context of the various claims made by state actors around their digital sovereignty. Indeed, QUIC was formally adopted at a time when many countries in the world, including in the EU, were flexing their regulatory and policy muscles in view to defend their so-called digital sovereignty, and including in internet standard setting processes. Yet, the analysis of QUIC's formulation process indicates that state actors were rather absent in those discussions, but the issue of states' control over the networks remained at the center of the debates and regularly used as a justification for both expanding or limiting the encryption of the traffic. So as a result, many of the innovative features of QUIC could be interpreted as a challenge to the ability of states to analyze the traffic of and communication. And according to one of our respondents, this is a quote that you can see on the slide, QUIC doesn't let the network operator inspect, and it is designed that way specifically to defeat certain kinds of state sovereignty. While US and UK security agencies were seen as closely monitoring the standardization process, there was no clear hindrance from states to the development of QUIC. And when questioning research participants about this paradox, about the absence of states despite the obvious impact of QUIC for their sovereignty, a few of them explained that Google had in fact preempted this debate from the very start of the process. While QUIC proposes to encrypt all traffic, including the sequence number of a connection, Google had strategically proposed that if a network operator decides not to use QUIC with UDP, it could use a default option, which is a fallback that was presented earlier by Francesca. And this fallback was both a necessity for Google at the time to ensure that all network operators and middle boxes would accept this QUIC traffic, but also a strategic move to ensure limited opposition to the deployment of QUIC. So several respondents, an expert from the IETF who participated directly to the QUIC standardization process, confirmed that the fallback offered them a crucial, in the using their own words, escape hatch. Thus, we argue that this led to a form of control inversion for states. While this fallback option indeed benefited network operators and the states at first sight, it is, however, becoming increasingly difficult to implement it as QUIC rolls out across the network, as we've seen in the previous slide. In other words, it is much more difficult for a state to block it than before without having a major impact on latency. And this too seems to have been anticipated by Google, but this was not clearly part of their arguments in IETF meetings. In the word of a research respondent, now that QUIC is pretty widely deployed, it makes it much harder for the network operators to say, we're going to block it now because the network will look worse. It performs worse than the other network operators. So the rapid and massive deployment of QUIC at the global level may further alter the ability of states to resort to this fallback process. The fact that QUIC has now a fairly wide deployment grants even more power to the deployers, and in this case, Google, for instance. Indeed, informal discussion within these companies suggests that you could soon imagine somebody removing the fallback, and so forcing QUIC connection one way or another. Accepted on the ground that network operators could resort to an alternative option if they dislike QUIC, Its wide deployment could further invert the power balance to the benefits of QUIC deployers and could force state into a more active role to monitor the internet traffic. So this leads us to the final part of our paper, reflecting a bit on this possible new step in the evolution of the global internet. Because from a technical standpoint, QUIC is a fundamental evolution for the internet's core architecture. QUIC indeed brings everything at the application layer, making most of the layered models that have historically represented the internet almost irrelevant abstractions. And so these shifts invite for discussion of its implication also for the process of internet consolidation that we will talk about, I guess, in the coming hours. Indeed, in a seemingly Darwinian process, QUIC provides a case in which the content application industry appears to have attempted to conclusively take over the lower layers carrier industry in a strategic and potentially irreversible way. And this brings me to the conclusion. We've presented QUIC as fostering a momentous architectural change in the ways in which communication and data packets transport happen on the internet. We've investigated the QUIC standardization process as a site of infrastructuring, where different socio-technical dynamics emerge between various actors, the giants of big tech, other actors of the internet industry, as well as states, and the latter as crucial yet often silenced entities. We've sought to demonstrate how the QUIC process infrastructures has evolved, reconfiguration in power imbalances, and in the respective weight between those actors with potentially long-term consequences for internet governance. Ultimately, this research contributes to unveil a number of insights related to the place of the private sector in standardization processes, the extent to which processes of consolidation and concentration of the internet around the big ones are influenced also by the making of standards, and the extent to which discussions and controversies on specific technical aspects of a standard actually reconfigure broader balances of power and decision-making on the present and close future of the internet. Finally, for scholars of digital sovereignty and of how this ambiguous concept gets embedded in infrastructures and standards, the QUIC case prompts further questions such as, can digital sovereignty of private actors exist and digital sovereignty of big tech? And has Google with QUIC taken one more steps towards its own digital sovereignty? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Super interesting findings. And then our second last speaker, Zhan from the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. Thank you. The floor is.
Thanks, our chair. And also my turn to say thanks for the conference organizer for bringing everybody here. I'm very glad to be here this morning to share with you part of the findings of this ongoing research, looking at the surviving strategy and development pathway of Huawei after the 5G controversy in Europe. I will start with the background information. So this study is basically a follow-up study from the paper I wrote 2 years ago, which just came out last week on the Journal of Global Media and Communication. So in that paper, I dealt with like the kind of social construction approach to look at the different social actors, like how they are shifting their roles, and especially what is the power dynamic among them engaging the Huawei controversy of 5G technology in Europe. So from this study, we could see that basically the general discussion in Europe about 5G is pretty much in line with the public discourse about Huawei, and both reached like the peak in 2019, right after the White House initiated the Huawei ban. So even if like European countries are not the first ones to take sides or make decisions between America or China among these technology standoff since 2017, But Europe has been and still is like one of the most strategic, important battlefields for Huawei's rollout of its 5G technology. And why is that? The global efforts for 5G technology, especially for the R&D, began around 2012. And 2012 was a time, if we look at the business, international business expansion of Huawei, we understood that the 3G and 4G business of Huawei already penetrated and expanded like in the majority of like many European countries. So if we go back to see the revenue of the country back in 2012, we could see that the region EMEA contributes, like it was like the #1 revenue generator then. So it was even more than the domestic market in China. And even if the revenue start to have a significant decline after 2019, after especially 2020, but still this region contributes quite a lot to Huawei's like annual revenue. And we could see also here like the North America, it's the least profitable for the company. So back to this business expansion of 3G and 4G in Europe already like in 2012, Huawei went on a lot of like investment, especially for 5G testbeds and trials in Europe. And according to the company's data, by 2020, more or less 46% of the commercial contracts about 5G the company signed globally were with like European partners. So this is to say the Huawei ban or the consequences from Huawei ban is not only on Huawei company itself, but it's also on many like European telecommunication network operators here, because to replace the telecommunication network equipment, it will significantly increase their construction and operation cost. And this is why it is important to look at this matter and to understand like how the company went on its business here in this region. The theoretical framework of this paper is coming from these 4 fields of studies connecting to technology and society. So the political economy of telecommunication is very important here because it deals a lot with this interplay between market force, policy decisions, and also the design choices of like telecommunication technology. And of course, like techno-nationalism, and also as our colleague just mentioned before, was also pretty important here to look at especially the China case, because many of the industrial policies in telecommunication and basically in general for ICT in China, those policies aligned quite a lot of technology innovation to the general economic growth, social stability, and also this overall prosperity of the society. And in particular, in the Huawei case, if you look at just the name of the company, Huawei in Chinese, it means China with achievement. So just the name of the company already evidence somehow this kind of sentiment of like techno-nationalism and patriotic features inside. And this paper also look at the survival culture of Huawei, as well as the emerging studies about geopolitics of 5G technology in general. Somehow, by doing this part of literature review, I understood like for many of the studies, like especially looking at Huawei case and looking at like the 5G controversy, most of the scholarly effort were drawing to like policymakers or public discourse. And there's a lack of studies looking into the corporate corpus from Huawei, like how the company itself is responding to those challenges and how the company is like positioning itself in this controversy, and also to explain what it is doing and going to do in the near future. So this is why like I thought these research questions in order to fill this research gap. And today I will more or less focus on the first 3 research questions from the data I collected. So in order to understand the internal corporate corpus, you could see here like the data collection so far, they are mostly concentrated on Huawei annual reports, corporate release, as well as this Huawei internal magazine called Huawei People. And the time period I chose is between 2019 to 2023. And in order to understand both a general picture of how the company was discursively positioning itself, and also to understand a little bit more in depth, I combined quantitative word cluster frequency test and co-occurrence matrix and semantic network to see the bigger picture, and also applied critical discourse analysis to see more in details. So I will now move to the findings part. This is a figure to show you the keyword distribution of Huawei's corporate corpus. If this one does not speak much, we could apply it into a timeline, and then it's more interesting. Just to remind you, so the entire corpus I collected, they are around 5G Europe and Europe within Huawei corporate narrative. So we could see here, even if the corpus is about 5G, but the mentioning of the accurate word of 5G is declining significantly in the past 5 years. However, the mentioning of European network carriers is still visible there, and also reached the peak around 2021 in the narrative of responding to especially green network or sustainable solutions for those European networks in that year. And also there is a kind of tendency of involving a wider context of industries or business partners connecting to 5G in general. And especially in contrast to this decline of 5G focus, there is a significant rise of cloud, especially in the year of 2023. And which is also pretty interesting is the overall concern or critics about Huawei 5G technology has been always about cyber security or national security, right? So the risk is about this, but the company did not respond risk according to those concerns, and instead it's more about credit risk. So it means the company focused basically more on the overall or general financial stability when it looks at in the European region in particular. So here is again some general features. So from the network, semantic network analysis here, we could see again this highlighted position of cloud. And what to be aware here is that even if the corpus is about Europe, but this entire EMEA region and also Asia were also quite visible in this network. And if we go to the right side to look at the co-occurrence matrix, we could see a clear emphasis from the company on especially the supply chain, how to show the capability of the company could secure its supply by relying on its global supply infrastructure. So to go a little bit deeper about how the company basically was narratively framing itself, I identified 5 main aspects to share with you today, because the corporate is still evolving at this moment. So the first one is about 5G. So we could see that when the outside world is buzzing around 5G and the problems Huawei 5G is encountering, the company already shifted from 5G to 5.5G. Maybe this is their strategy of avoiding straightforward confrontation of 5G. So it moved away. Another interesting thing here is that back in 2019, the company was pretty much like openly talking about its collaboration of partnership in Europe. For example, ELISA in Finland and Sunrise in Switzerland. But after 2020, especially after Telenor in Norway chose like Ericsson over Huawei, and then this kind of like narrative about the European telecommunication like carriers starts to fade away in the corporate narrative. So Huawei start to go much more like low profile to name the European collaborators. For example, in the year of 2021, under this quite intensive discussion about like a green network, I couldn't identify which one is this Italian carrier that the company was emphasizing about. So there's just no way to look at it anymore. But however, another very, very important like things here is that Huawei responded a lot to the standardization from especially ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, in order to demonstrate that everything the company is trying to do is in compliance with the regional standards here in Europe. And the similar thing can also be found to look at this increase of like Huawei Cloud. So again, the company demonstrated quite a lot about its adherence to the EU Cloud Code of Conduct and GDPR compliance standards in general. And another feature here is like from this techno-nationalism, we could see a clear like localization strategy the company was emphasizing or demonstrating in terms of like Huawei Cloud. So it focused on this in Europe, for Europe, by engaging or empowering European enterprises like overall in order to enable this local ecosystem here in Europe. Interestingly, maybe due to the fact that the company has invested like over 150 million euros in Ireland for this Huawei Cloud Hub in Europe. So Ireland stands out when we look at like this matter there. And at the same time, like other business entities in Hungary, in Germany, in France, they were very vaguely mentioned, but we do not know who are those partners for Huawei in this particular field. And the third thing is about the supply chain, which showed, like already I showed you before on this co-occurrence matrix. So here, even if Hungary has been the country, especially in Central and Eastern part of Europe, supporting Huawei quite a lot in these years. But the narrative that the company focused on Hungary has been pretty much consistent, only highlighting this supply center in Hungary. And again, like mostly demonstrating the technological sophistication of this center, as well as how the company could utilize this center as part of the global supply chain infrastructure the company has been building up. Besides these three aspects, there are two more aspects which did not appear at all from the quantitative analysis, but only appeared in the qualitative discourse analysis. One is about AI computing. So with AI computing, again, here we could see the similar narrative about like in Europe for Europe. So it also emphasized pretty much about this, how the company invests to jointly shape a European AI industry. And the similar feature can also be found here that Huawei also responded quite a lot about how the company would participate again in standardization for AI trustworthy, drawing connection to, again, ETSI and also other international norms distributed or published by ITU and ISO. And the last finding here from the qualitative part is that the corporate corpus also go beyond the business sectors It also talked a lot about the social values Huawei tried to bring for European societies here, including how the company was certificated as one of the top European employer every year, and also how the company was investing for talent growth in Europe and to support startup development and empowering especially women leadership for gender equality here, and also how the company was even like contributed for a kind of societal inclusiveness with different initiatives around. So to conclude here, after all, like from both like the quantitative and qualitative results, I consider the overall approach of Huawei in these 5 years a kind of like forward-looking roundabout tactics. What does it mean? It means like the company did not go for immediate steps. It doesn't go there at all. It doesn't hit the target. Basically, it's like going around, introducing many new initiatives, like shifting the business even just with 5G itself, in order to like focus more on a kind of positional advantage for a general setup, like for the future. So, and by doing so, that's why like we saw, for example, the focus on this, especially localization strategy here, and a clear shift from techno-nationalism approach to in Europe for Europe strategy, considering in China in these 5 years, the techno-nationalism is really on the rise in the domestic like sentiment context. And then we also see this strong emphasis of the company to focus on this compliance with European regional standardization. And we also see like how they were trying to demonstrate itself, like all the technological focus are all within the European technological frameworks, and also in the end, like how the company also contributed and will continue to contribute more positively to the European societies in general. So that's it for my presentation, and here are the references like for someone who are interested to read more. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for these insights into what Huawei and their strategy in Europe. And then our final speaker for this panel.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to this exciting event. The paper I'm going to be talking about today follows the key regulatory device for countering terrorist and violent extremist content, or TVEC, online. That's the hash sharing database of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or GIFCT. And it draws on interviews that I've done with platform counterterrorism experts. And also I've been involved in a number of working groups inside the GIFCT for the last few years as well. And it draws on my observations there. The GIFCT hash sharing database is a powerful algorithmic upload filtering device that effectively screens all content posted to the world's largest social media platforms against a shared database of images, videos, and PDFs that have been hashed or translated into a unique digital fingerprint for being terrorist or violent extremist in nature. And when uploaded content matches a hash in the database, it can be deleted from the internet almost instantaneously. So when the live stream of the 2019 terrorist attack in Christchurch went viral online, this database was one of the key devices that was used to remove copies of the video that were circulating. So most of the academic debate about the hash sharing database focuses on issues of online censorship, transparency, and human rights compliance. It uses frameworks like global administrative law or business and human rights and freedom of expression to analyze and critique its effects. But I argue that the hash sharing database and the wider socio-technical relations and governance practices that it puts into motion can be better understood as a global security infrastructure. And because the hash sharing infrastructure is emergent and it's composed of socio-technical processes, it needs to be studied in action through the relations and effects that it's giving rise to in practice. So my argument has a conceptual and a methodological dimension that's drawing on critical infrastructure studies, actor network theory, and Foucauldian governmentality scholarship. And I'm also making a related claim about how to study law and regulation in global security infrastructures like the hash sharing database. So I'm going to start by briefly elaborating those key threads of the argument before then highlighting some of the novel and distinctive effects that this infrastructure is generating in practice. So the first conceptual move is that global security infrastructures aren't so much concrete things or invisible technological substrates, but dispositifs or governance assemblages that are generative and that have a distinctive material agency. They enact new networks, forms of knowledge, power, and scale that reshape and create global security. So in my analysis, TVEC is not a pre-existing object that precedes the hash sharing infrastructure, but an emergent effect of its operations. And the hash sharing database is not a tool that allows platforms to govern in the shadow of the state, but an infrastructural site and set of socio-technical practices where public-private relations in global security are being recomposed. The second methodological move concerns relationality and how the different elements that make up global security infrastructures, the actors, the devices, the discourses, the legal forms, the algorithmic processes, should be studied in and through the relations that they forge in practice. Or as STS scholar John Law puts it, in a relational approach, quote, realities, objects, subjects, materials, and meanings should all be explored as an effect of the relations that are assembling and doing them. Thirdly, and in contrast to most of the scholarship on algorithmic governance that conceptualizes law as an external normative force that regulates data infrastructures from afar, the infralegalities approach that I'm using understands legal techniques, regulatory processes, and data infrastructures as relationally entangled and co-productive. In other words, law is not some normative rampart standing above a sea of technological change, but it's actually one of the moving parts that's in motion. And empirically studying global security infrastructures in action gives us a way to grasp these novel forms of human machining agency and infralegal dynamics. So these are some of the broader theoretical and methodological contributions that the paper tries to make. And I want to now discuss some of the key effects that this global security infrastructure is generating in practice. Firstly, the hash sharing infrastructure is reconfiguring the spatio-temporal scope of online counterterrorism governance. So earlier systems for online counterterrorism largely relied on flagging and reporting, either by users or trusted flaggers or governments or counterterrorism internet referral units or IRUs, using notice and takedown procedures. For example, the approach that's currently used in the UK under the Terrorism Act is reactive and it's steeped in layers of human review. There are specialist police officers from the CTIRU who trawl the internet each day searching for keywords and violating material. So this is an approach that effectively waits for harmful online material to be brought to the platform's attention, with human reviewers assessing it post hoc against various standards. Governing TVEC through the hash sharing database works in very different registers. Here, TVEC is flagged automatically without notice based on algorithmically detected similarity with previously hashed material. And whilst the original classification of the hash content requires some human labeling, the algorithmic detection and content removal process is almost entirely automated. This speed is the key added value of the hash sharing database because it allows platforms to moderate TVEC at scale at the speeds that regulators like the UK and EU are increasingly requiring. And the material affordances of the hash sharing database actually enhance this temporality as well. Perceptual hash matching is considered a high throughput computational technique for detecting similarity between digital files without inferring any meaning or considering their context. And I mention that because it stands in direct contrast to more computationally intensive processes like machine learning or artificial intelligence. So important policy choices about what terrorism is are encoded into the design of the hash sharing infrastructure itself. And there's very little scope for human input. Notice and takedown procedures for removing TVEC are often limited in scope to the jurisdiction that's authorizing the takedown. But content removed by the hash sharing database is tied to the taxonomy of the database for labeling hash material and the terms of service of GIFCT platforms. And so the jurisdictional reach of the hash sharing infrastructure is expansive and truly global, which is particularly attractive to states because of the extraterritorial security governance possibilities that it potentially affords them, which I'll discuss in a moment. Secondly, the hash sharing infrastructure has powerful global standard setting effects. It's generating new norms and classification practices for governing terrorism and violent extremism at a time when there is no international consensus about what those terms mean and a heightened interest by both states and platforms to govern in these areas. Platforms govern here, but they do so in divergent ways using different combinations of content policies and terms of service, prescription lists, and other norm-making practices. In this context, the hash sharing database is performing crucial global security governance work because it's creating a new shared counterterrorism taxonomy and standards that are generating normative consistency between platforms and allowing common TVEC governance to take place. There is a rough and flexible taxonomy for including content into the database that uses the UN Security Council's Al-Qaeda and ISIL sanctions list as a proxy for determining what TVEC is. But GIFCT expand that list by linking it to a much more amorphous category of terrorist glorification, which constitutes about 80% of all of the hash material in the database. As one interviewee put it, quote, "This has enabled us to have an agreed upon approach for dealing with this content and helped us to establish a baseline of norms in this space. The taxonomies we use in labeling TVEC content will be setting the norms and standards for the industry," end quote. Since 2021, GIFCT have been expanding the scope of this taxonomy to target a much wider array of violent extremist material that's not tied to Islamist groups. And that includes far-right and white supremacist content. So this has involved moving away from a list-based approach towards a content and behavior-based approach, which works across a much wider array of media formats, including photos, images, text, PDFs, and URLs. To do this, GIFCT are building what they call, quote, "a common understanding of terrorism and violent extremism." This is understood to be something very different from a legal definition of these hugely contentious terms. It's something that is shaped by the affordances of the hash sharing database and the practical constraints of platforms doing content moderation at scale. So we can see in this example some of the concrete ways that the emergent hash sharing infrastructure and legal processes are co-productive, and they're giving rise to powerful regulatory effects that are hugely consequential for the ways that global security risks are known and governed. And thirdly, the hash sharing infrastructure is enacting a co-regulatory architecture of control that's enmeshing the dynamics of global security and informational capitalism and reassembling public-private relations. Now, for legal scholar Julie Cohen, what is critical in these forms of co-regulation is, quote, "that each participant in the development of digital architectures of control sees in the other's goals a window of opportunity," end quote. And that is precisely what the hash sharing database enables. its global standard setting and cross-platform governance capabilities are bringing powerful states and platforms together in novel ways. And it's been strategically used by platforms to reshape their relations with states and regulatory bodies in contests over liability for online harms, including in the EU and the UK. So in 2019, the director of the US National Counterterrorism Center, Russell Travers, gave a talk arguing that new forms of cooperation between platforms and intelligence agencies needed to be fostered by building what he called a whole-of-society approach to countering TVEC, founded on public-private partnerships and greater public-private information sharing. And GIFCT was singled out as the most promising example of this kind of co-regulatory arrangement. Travers' predecessor for NCTC director was Nicholas Rasmussen, who went on to become the first executive director of the GIFCT in 2020. And after praising the GIFCT for what he called its unique whole-of-society approach to countering TVEC, he then began sharing operational information with the NCTC. The Independent Advisory Committee, of which I'm now a part of inside the GIFCT, includes members from the Office of Security and Counterterrorism in the UK Home Office, the French Foreign Ministry, the National Security Council of the White House in the United States. So that such powerful security and intelligence bodies are convening through this database inside the GIFCT gives you some sense of its importance. Now, for platforms, the GIFCT's whole-of-society approach and multi-stakeholder discourse helps them shift responsibility for intractable online problems and reinforce the idea that industry self-regulation is best for countering TVEC. And the strategic and commercial value of that at a time when lawmakers from all over the world are calling for the powers of big tech to be reined in through reforming online liability law is exceptionally large. So the hash sharing infrastructure is an ideological and discursive resource for platforms to shape regulatory oversight efforts and showcase the value of an industry-led self-regulation. And it gives states and intelligence agencies new opportunities for public-private data sharing and global norm creation. So in conclusion, in my analysis, the GIFCT hash sharing database is much more than a content moderation tool for flagging harmful content. It's assembling a powerful global security infrastructure that is reshaping how online risks are regulated. It's mediating tensions between platforms and states in generative ways, and it's reconfiguring how contentious problems of political violence are known and governed. Governing TVEC by embedding standards into forms of design-based regulation for filtering online content at scale attenuates the scope for individualized accountability that's usually associated with the rule of law. Counterterrorism law, for example, usually governs legal subjects, but the hash sharing database governs algorithmically in ways that aren't reliant on legal personhood. And that's having significant consequences for how rights and redress are afforded. The infrastructure is enabling important spatio-temporal shifts in security governance from reactive, human-led, and jurisdictionally bounded forms of review to automated and instantaneous norm enforcement that are operating continuously on a global scale. And it's allowing new classification practices on terrorism and violent extremism to emerge that are shaped more by the socio-technical affordances of hash sharing than by the 150 years of legal debates about what constitutes terrorism. So I've argued that confronting the stakes of those challenges requires empirically analyzing global security infrastructures as emergent socio-technical assemblages to unpack the relations, practices, and dynamics that are holding them together, and to show their distinctive ontological politics and their material agency. And I've used infralegalities as a device for doing this work and showing how the regulatory practices and infrastructural conditions are entangled and co-produced. Now, for Foucault, the key value of this kind of relational approach is that it helps us identify, quote, the nature of the linkages that exist between heterogeneous elements that allow new forms of governance to arise. And it also pushes those of us who are interested in platform security governance to take the affordances of infrastructure and the emergent forms of agency that they're generating much more seriously in our analysis. Thanks, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Now it's working, yes. So that was really a rich panel, I thought, and we just agreed here that we can go a little bit over time, so we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. And to kick that off, I'll just propose some initial thoughts that I had while listening to you, all the great panelists. So we heard Wanda give us sort of also the historical line into this current development this morning, and one of the things you said was that privatization of security is not new. We've seen that for many, many years. Yet I get the sense that we're talking about something that is new here in nature and scope. So I think that's really the interesting question, and also the interesting sort of conceptual work we have to do is to sort of understand and also propose new frameworks for how to move further, both practically and theoretically, in terms of the understanding of how this relationship between these big technology companies and states are different or challenging our usual approaches to understanding state and private company interactions. Because we've talked about that for years, we've regulated private action for years, yet there is something different at stake here. And I would say that three conceptual frames that it would be good, at least in my mind, to understand some of those changes are related to the type of agency they hold, the power they hold in society, and also their implications on fundamental rights of citizens in society. We've heard many examples during these last 2 hours on how government and technology companies themselves understand and frame their role, and also very concrete examples of how practices emerge, how they make their power sustain and materialize in different domains. And I would say that there is something there. I mean, the title of this panel was infrastructural, what was it? Infrastructural, infrastructuring the digital world. And there is something where these actors play a different role in terms of their integration into society's core infrastructures that challenge our ability to regulate them and control their power, that I think is crucial. The way that they combine both technological, political, and economic power in society and has such cross-cutting range. As I mentioned, I work a lot with human rights protection, and one of the big challenges here is precisely that the human rights implications of private companies we've known for many, many years, and that is usually a human rights impact that's rather specific or local or concentrated on a specific industry in specific cases that we can understand. But with some of these companies here, it's really very truly infrastructural in the way that they govern and control the places and the platforms and the discourses where rights are exercised and where society's different social domains are regulated. So I think we need to move forward in terms of thinking of new conceptual frameworks that moves closer not only to the specific cases, but also to provide frameworks that we can use from across media studies, political science, human rights, regulation, whatever, to understand in more detail that agency and power that these actors hold. that was one thing I was thinking. The other thing I was thinking is the methodological challenge in terms of studying them as researchers. I've done a lot of interview-based work myself with these tech giants, and it's, I mean, the kind of discourse you get is often so generic and predictable that, you know, after having done it for a while, you wonder, is it really worth it? Because you know already what answer you'll be getting before you close the questions. So that's on the narrative side, but also on the practice side, it can be really, really difficult to open up. I mean, I know your people one is really excellent in that, but it's really difficult to open up the algorithms and the companies themselves to an extent where you can get a more granular understanding of the practices unfolding. And here I think we've seen some great examples today that actually has opened up and explained some of these practices. So with these few remarks, I'll open the floor to you for questions. We have the first one there.
Yes, hello. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself earlier. My name is Ilan Mano, and I'm the digital policy scholar. First of all, thank you very much for this really insightful panel. I want to give you a bit cheeky and maybe ask two questions. Good questions. First one to Zoe, you talked about techno-exceptionalism, and it also seems to me that sometimes we have a form of TikTok exceptionalism. That TikTok is somehow viewed very differently by policymakers and even diplomats or governments than other social media. And I was wondering what you think about the exceptionalism of TikTok, and where will TikTok fit in your model that you depicted in the talk today? And the second question to Gavin, what you're really showing us is that more and more CB activities, country environment extremism, will be run by algorithms with humans out of the loop. And what we've seen in the past is that this kind of automation of decision making, where we move to algorithms and there's no human, creating systems that very few humans actually understand. And do you think we're going to see that in CBE as well, where when we move to algorithm-based decision making, lawmakers, policymakers, even national police systems will find it more and more difficult to understand how these algorithms actually operate and what they're actually using to resolve the content. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And if I wasn't rushing through my presentation so much, I might have addressed this point, which is the question about, I think when we speak about techno-nationalism, absolutely the most dominant question that comes up is that, you know, what Zhan was mentioning in terms of the Huawei narrative around 5G, and particularly this exceptional take on TikTok bans through that lens of the relationship between Chinese tech and the Chinese government. The reason that the frame that I took in my research was to try and unpick that same dynamic between US tech and US allied governments was partly because I feel like that's where there's a bit more, for me there was more intrigue in that, because it feels like less clear as to how that relationship would play out. But to answer your question specifically, where would it fit? It would fit squarely in that narrative that's playing out there as a techno-nationalism narrative, absolutely. But I would challenge the assumption that it's that the TikTok view is so black and white, I guess, globally. Like it is in the dominant discourses that we're hearing out of Western democracies, but I guess the view from the Pacific is quite interesting. And one of the things that came through in one of my expert interviews was someone speaking about who had worked in foreign affairs and engaged in the Pacific region with other governments on these topics. And I guess the take from that was the question of the intention and techno-nationalism implications of China tech versus US tech is actually more on the fence in those countries. And I think that that's something that's the reason I think doing some, like trying to expand this work of mine with the regional focus would be great, because I think it's very easy to, and I do it myself, to be very focused on that Western narrative. But I think that for countries in the Indo-Pacific, there is high distrust of US tech for the same reason. For that, there is a strong perception that linked to US intelligence for US tech. So I actually think that for them, for a lot of those countries, and this is what came through in the interviews, is that it is more of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other for those governments looking at these foreign tech companies between the US and China. So I suppose it really depends on exactly who you're asking, which again goes to that point about it is quite contextual. So yeah, I think it's a clear answer on techno-nationalism from like a US, European, Australian lens, but maybe more complicated answer if you ask other countries. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sorry, still working out. I don't need it, but I'll thank you. Yes, thanks. So yes, this is a machine for countering violent extremism online, and it does demonstrate the growing importance of CVE as a kind of governance discourse. In fact, many of the participants in the Independent Advisory Committee all come from CVE backgrounds as well. So it is really a kind of internationalization of the CVE agenda in many ways. There was a kind of tension perhaps in the talk that I tried to introduce. I tried to say that this is a socio-technical assemblage. So there are very much humans involved here, but not necessarily in the places where you might think. So 2 points that might clarify. To answer your question, are we moving towards the use of technical systems where the human in the loop becomes illusory? Yes, we are. But the system I was describing here was not necessarily such a system. If I was talking about an unsupervised machine learning infrastructure, as I'm doing other research in that area in the border security space, where we're looking at kind of neural net machine learning infrastructures. And there really we're moving towards systems of governance that operate at a level of complexity and speed that it's almost impossible to reverse engineer the inference processes through which insights become actionable. So yes, that's where the human in the loop question becomes very clear. On the algorithmic infrastructure that I described today, it's a different type of algorithm, the hashing algorithm. So those of you may be familiar with the photo DNA system that's used for countering child exploitation material on the internet, or the content ID system that's used in YouTube for enforcing copyright. It's the same type of perceptual hash matching algorithms that are used there. One, it's a form of architectural regulation, so it's about instantaneous norm enforcement. So in that sense, there's no human in the loop once it's up and running. The value of this type of algorithm is that you don't need a lot of training data to get it. It doesn't spot new material, it detects pre-existing material. So it's a similarity detection algorithm. But for people I've spoken to in the industry and in government and elsewhere, a lot of the hype about AI and machine learning is misplaced, because in the industry, it's often that detection copy algorithms are used simultaneously with unsupervised machine learning tools, and they work together in those ways. There are humans in the loop here. And I guess when I was talking about the norm generation and the taxonomy debates that are happening within the GIF-CT, you've got human actors, institutions, shaping norms in that space in a really interesting way. I guess the point of distinction that I was trying to draw in the presentation, I'll make it up here, is that a lot of the critical literature about this stuff says it's about states governing platforms or outsourcing to private platforms. What I'm seeing happening is much more the emergence of a digital ecology where shared norms can be developed around things like a taxonomy expansion project, which isn't about individual pieces of content, but it's about building a relational network of public and private actors where both what public and private mean is being reshaped, and it's having huge effects. That's so yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you to speak to the question or the relationship between these sort of technical classifications and formal law.
Yeah.
So whether whether you can perceive that those sort of technical effects, basically, those classification effects will also eventually play a role in formal legal discussions. And maybe that can be related because I know this is also would speak to you. It's a question of redress and accountability. If you could speak to how these systems maybe change or reorganize questions of redress and accountability, maybe also a little bit about the kinds of violence or harm that's related to the system, because they seem to be quite different from your previous work.
Thanks, Marianne. Yes, I mean, that's the point of this dispositif, I think, is to understand how informal socio-technical classifications feed into and shape more formal regulatory processes. I haven't got a kind of, what do they call it, a smoking gun that shows this to that. But I certainly think that the entire operation of this database is facilitating the kinds of discussions, particularly around this taxonomy expansion, that are reshaping particular efforts by states. So what I didn't talk about in the talk was how the hash sharing database, for example, has been used strategically by platforms to shape emergent legislation in this place. For example, in the Online Safety Act in the UK, which has established basically the use of the hash sharing database as best practice for the industry. I also see, although I can't really speak about it in my paper or the presentation because I'm bound by confidentiality, but now that I sit inside the IAC of the GIFCT, I see a little bit more how these discussions take place. Home Office want to adjust the way the GIFCT govern in this way. The National Security Council in the US want to change it this way. There is informal negotiation taking place. It is shaping norms, particularly around how these standards, but I haven't been able to get in and use the database to show the material, socio-material processes through which this leads to that. But I have observed the internal ecology of the GIFCT around the database. And I think that that is the point, actually, that it is about modulating the environment within which terrorism and violent extremism comes to be known, particularly violent extremism. On the question of rights and redress, and I'll be brief there, yes, there's a whole part of this infrastructure which is about that, which I didn't really talk about. One of the interesting things to me is that hashing, according to the GIFCT, hashing doesn't engage a specific person. It governs in the absence of a specific person. So one of the things I'm following in the research is when you have human rights critics saying this is not compliant with human rights, and you've got an algorithmic infrastructure that says, well, we're not governing subjects, we're governing behavioral patterns and content. What kind of redress emerges out of that? And that's what I'm interested in following at the moment, which is kind of like a hybrid of the affordances of the infrastructure and the way we think about human rights. And that's part of the methodological point that I was making, is that if we come into that space looking for human rights, you're not going to find it. But if you come in asking, how are human rights being reshaped by the affordances of this infrastructure, then we find something that gets closer to your answer.
Okay, I just add something to this first part of Gavin's answer. Completely agree with what Gavin was saying. In the question of to what extent is the momentum that's been gained around this public-private sort of governance architecture in terms of the taxonomy around TVEC, I'll just share one quick anecdote from the Australian perspective. In Australia, we have an Online Safety Act, and we say to the internet that's currently in a court case against Elon Musk for failing to comply with content data in Australia. I think that people could imply that's escalated before. But one of the things that I think get involved in some of the narratives on the company side is this reference and ability to refer to a growing global consensus from which a national jurisdiction is departing, right? So part of it is validated by saying, well, we have this global conversation, there's norm setting that's happening at a global level, and really creating that argument to push back on national jurisdictions that are taking that approach.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have to finish because we have lunch waiting, but let's give the whole panel a hand again.